We just heard about the US sanctions laws, and more, because of the sanctions, we have seen growing concerns of humanitarian aid not reaching civilians and those in need in Iran. We'd like to take this opportunity to learn more about these impacts. I'm Sogol Shishtarian, IABA National Liaison and Vice President of the NorCal chapter. I'm honored to be moderating this panel and very honored to briefly introduce our guests, panel speakers, and then give them an opportunity to tell us more about themselves and their organizations. Elika Eftekhari is an international trade attorney, Director of Trade Compliance and Government Relations at the U.S.-Iran Chamber of Commerce, President of Alamet Trade Partners, an international trade import and export consultancy firm, and IABA Foundation Chair. Next to her is Nancy Wilson. She's the CEO of Relief International, a nonprofit agency that carries out humanitarian and development work in 16 countries, including Iran. And finally, Katarine Shaya is the board chair of Children of Persia, a nonprofit organization that serves vulnerable and underprivileged children in Iran. I'd like to ask each of the panel members to tell us a bit more about their work and their organizations. If we can start with Elika.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm very glad to be here. I'm coming all the way from DC, so just really glad to be here. It's my first conference. I've been on the IABA Foundation board for a couple of years, but I am sad to say this is my first conference, but very glad to be here. So what I'm going to talk about, it will help you to understand the organization that I'm coming from. The U.S.-Iran Chamber of Commerce is an organization, it's a nonprofit, like most chambers of commerce are, and it was founded in 2014, right during the time period that the JCPOA negotiations were underway. It didn't really make sense to have, there were some attempts in the past 20 years really to create a chamber of commerce for our community, but everything fizzled out and what have you. So in the JCPOA context, it made a lot of sense. And my background is that, after law firm and what have you, I then went to the U.S. Department of Commerce. And at Commerce, I oversaw a very large trade portfolio of products. It was a lot of tariff-based work, a lot of subsidies, all of the tariffs you talk about, aluminum, steel, those were cases I worked on. I had one case involving Iran, which was the pistachios case, that the U.S. has at that time it was a 387% tariff on Iranian pistachios, and that's simply a function of California's pistachio industry being Iran's #1 competitor. And I was at Commerce one day, I was ready to leave government, and online I stumbled upon an organization called U.S.-Iran Chamber of Commerce, as I had my typical Iranian reaction of who are they, what are they about, who's Kian, So I reached out from my commerce desk, and I probably terrified them, and said, hi, I'm a U.S. international trade attorney from Commerce. I've never heard of you before. I'd like to meet with you. I want to understand what it is that you do. I hope I said something terrible, like, I hope you're not just a bunch of students, because a chamber of organization means something in D.C. It does certain things, and so that led to a quick meeting where I got to know this group of people who volunteer their time. Every one of us, we all work on a volunteer basis. We only get paid if a client pays us, and then really it's the work we do is we see the mission as trying to fill the gap, and by that I mean other minority communities in the United States, they have their own chambers of commerce, which is why last year we launched the Iranian American Chamber of Commerce Division, wanting to strengthen our voice through our business community. But when I joined the U.S.-Iran Chamber of Commerce in 2016, we were in the heyday of the JCPOA, and so the bulk of my work involved taking what I knew at the U.S. Department of Commerce, the methodologies that we designed there, and putting those to work with my Iran expertise, to the extent I have some, and creating due diligence methodologies that American businesses, European businesses could use so that they can do robust, fulsome due diligence that, OFAC isn't going to raise an eyebrow to. So in that regard, the organization has tried not to compete or overlap with what law firms do, but rather we have a lot of law firms who will come to us and say, hey, Caterpillar is a client of mine. They have these questions. We can't answer them. And so, the organization had a lot of interest, as I'm sure we all saw when the JCPOA was signed. And then since last year, with the Trump administration's withdrawal, we focused more on the Iranian American Chamber of Commerce end. But I would say what I'm going to talk about mostly today is going to reflect the bulk of my work, which has involved dealing directly with companies, as well as directly on the Hill with various congressional offices. Anytime the chamber deals with a company, we always loop in their congressperson so everyone's on the same page and they know what we're doing and what have you. So that's a bit of background about the chamber.
Thank you, Elka. Nancy?
Great. Well, good to see you all this morning, and thank you for including me on the panel, and thank you, a shout out to Eric Ferrari for introducing us to IABA. One of the joys of being at the CEO of Relief International is to be at the helm of an organization that's been working in Iran for almost 30 years. And our work there is much the same as we do around the world, where we really are addressing some acute emergency needs, but also building in long-term sustainability and resilience. So on the sort of acute needs side, we respond to earthquakes and other natural disasters. In fact, our first work in Iran was in response to the 1990 Manjil-Rudbar earthquake, and that was an initiative of some Iranian Americans here in the Los Angeles area. I was actually in Iran in the fall of 2017 and stood there on those cold and dusty plains in Kermanshah and speaking with families who were now standing behind the rubble, next to the rubble ruins of their homes. We were able to get in there and do some assessments about what was needed, particularly in the sort of second phase after the sort of first couple of days. And we're able to provide some insulated floor mats because people were living in really sort of shacks next to their homes. And in the winter, it gets very cold when you're sitting on the floor. And also some dust masks to help prevent asthma or other kind of lung diseases. And then rebuilt several schools in the area. More recently, we've been responding to the floods in Iran. As you know, they were nearly all over the country, and frankly, while the ability of the government to respond to emergencies is really actually quite impressive, it totally overwhelmed them given how many communities were underwater. And when those floods came through those communities, people lost everything. Their homes, all their possessions, and very often in these rural areas, their livelihood in the form of their livestock. So one of the things that we've been doing, and there we were in Sistan, Baluchistan in particular, was both to distribute hygiene kits so that people had soap and towels and things to get through, the day, as well as some vouchers to be able to buy groceries, but also to be able to buy new goats, which turns out to be pretty important for the long-term sustainability. Another area of work we've done is with Afghan refugees. Now, keep in mind that up until the Syrian crisis, Iran was host to the largest number of refugees of any other country in the world. There were somewhere between 3 and 4.5 million Afghans living in Iran back from the Russian invasion. These are mostly unregistered, and historically there was very little international assistance. But that population, that's about as many people, or that's more than the number of people living in Orange County. This is a lot of people who are distributed all around the country. Our work there has focused on educational access and health access. So let me tell you the story of Zara. Zara lives with her dad in a shack in an agricultural field, in the middle of an agricultural field, growing vegetables, outside of Mashhad. Her mother is gone, and here she is, 9 years old, and she has never been to school. Now, in Iran, if you do not enter at the right age, you cannot go when you age out. So this was sort of her last opportunity, and some of our Afghan outreach workers identified her situation and enrolled her in our school readiness program. It's 7 weeks over the summer, and her teacher said, boy, at the beginning it was really chaotic. She just couldn't sit down and stay put, couldn't concentrate on anything for any period of time. and was pretty hostile with her classmates. But by the end of the 7 weeks, she'd learned to take on some responsibility for the class, had generated a lot of, sort of demonstrated her caring attitude toward her classmates, and was able to concentrate and follow instructions and respond appropriately in the class, and was able to then successfully enter first grade that fall and has made a good go of it. In this sense, Zahra really represents one of many children like this. This was in Mashhad, but we also do the program in Zahedan, Tehran, Yazd, and Alborz, and altogether have served about 21,000 children. That's as many as would more than sell out the Staples Center. So that's a lot of lives that we're changing. We've also been doing the same in healthcare. The third area of work, and I have to say, when I first joined Relief International, I was surprised that we had the ability to do this, not as an organization, but the scope within Iran. And that is that we've been training staff of Iranian civil society organizations that respond to drug addiction, that respond to job development and creation, a full range of kinds of social services in the country. In this sense, we're doing work that really has a sort of an exponential impact. We've trained 350 staff members to now be able to write proposals, understand how to raise money for their organizations, and make sure that they're delivering programs that have a meaningful impact over time.
Thank you, Nancy. I'll move over and then we'll come back. Thank you
thanks.
on the questions. Katayun, could you please tell us more about Children of Persia?
For a second. Hi, everyone, and thank you, IABA, for the opportunity for us to be here. We're quite honored. We've been working with your DC chapter. I also am from DC area. We were just joking that maybe you all should come to DC because all three of us are from DC. But we are very grateful to you all and the professional assistance you provide to our community. Back in 2015, we actually awarded IABA for the pro bono work that your members have done on behalf of some of the families that we work with in DC area, providing for social services programs in their lives back in DC area. So thank you for that, and thank you for this opportunity to be here. Like Nancy, majority of our work, well, not like Nancy, but similar to Nancy, majority of our work is in Iran. We have been in existence for about 20 years. We have a very simple and humble beginning where we got a request from an orphanage in Iran where the school for girls was dependent upon an adult center for their daily food. And during the month of Ramadan, the kitchen was closed at the adult school, and the kids didn't have lunch, or they didn't have food during the day. So we were asked whether we could help supply food for a month. And several of our families became together, and this was before our organization, Children of Persia, was born, and basically just provided a month's worth of food, and kind of from that energy realized, oh my God, we can do something, we can take action, we can come together and be effective in delivering help that's much needed. So Children of Persia was born back in 1999. We're an all-volunteer organization. I myself am by education an architect. I practice in my profession. This is something that we do out of our passion, volunteering on the side. We're seven-person board of directors, and all of us are volunteers. We have lots of programs that we implement in Iran. Our model is working through NGOs. We do not have an organization or registered organization in our own name in Iran, but we do have a number of NGOs that we work with on implementing programs in disadvantaged children's education, healthcare, and a variety of programs relating to their daily lives. We also step in emergencies and provide immediate relief through our NGOs in Iran, as well as doing long-term reconstruction work. We started out this effort in Bam earthquake, followed by Kermanshah earthquake, and actually followed by Azerbaijan earthquake, and then Kermanshah. And as you know, in the last day or so, there's been another earthquake in Azerbaijan that we have a field team, actually, because we have volunteers there that are assessing the situation to figure out in kind of long term what type of help might be needed. So we also have built schools, we've built clinics. We are currently working on kind of completing a reconstruction project in Kermanshah, doing kind of water distribution system that will serve 12 villages that have lost their secure water source because of the earthquake. And we anticipate that by the end of this month, that work will be completed, so 12 villages are able to get secure access to drinking water. And it actually started with wanting to serve the school we built there, realizing that we were at the end of the trunk line for the water distribution. And in order to get water to us, we had to kind of move further up source. And so we are hoping that that will be finished by the end of this year. We also have, since our very beginning, we have been working with street and working children. We have adopted several kind of organizations who do this work, and one of them in Karaj called Khane Mehr. They started out with one-room school, and they now have 3 schools and 4 buildings. We have helped them build vocational school where children who could not continue under the previous, I guess, educational regulations because of lack of papers, legal existence in Iran, be able to get high school diploma, for example, to continue on their existence or educational world. We helped build a vocational school so these kids can learn trade. And from 9th grade, they would enter this trade school and learn a variety of crafts that instead of selling flowers in the streets or opening fall of Hafiz fall in the streets, that they would actually be able to engage in some meaningful and skilled level of work. So that's that, and our relationship with that group continues. And I think I'm going to stop here. We'll continue with the panel, but so that's a very kind of small section of the work that we do.
Thank you all. I'd love to start off and ask Katayun and Nancy to speak to the impact of sanctions on the work that they've mentioned and the humanitarian work that they do in Iran.
Do you want to go?
Okay, I'll start. So I think the first important thing to keep in mind is that we are operating in 16 countries around the world, and our guiding principles are the international humanitarian principles, right, of humanity, so respecting and protecting life, impartiality, neutrality, and operational independence. And these really underpin our approach to our work in Iran. I think to understand the impact of sanctions, we have to sort of start with, well, what was the baseline before the sanctions fell into place? So in the lead up to and the signing of the JCPOA, some things were actually going quite well. We had a good working relationship with the Internal Affairs Office, that we know as BAFIA, and found many areas of common interest. We were able to do a pilot program and demonstrate our use of impartial criteria for selecting beneficiaries, which they found quite fascinating. Oh, yep, Mike, sorry. And then that gave us permission to move into some other areas. They also made some policy changes so that if people enrolled their children in school, particularly the Afghan refugees, in school or brought them to healthcare facilities, they were then exempt from deportation because you can imagine you wouldn't take your kid to school if you thought they were going to send you packing back home. We also got permission to do a joint needs assessment with 2 other INGOs. It was national in scope, on the situation of the Afghan population, household surveys on income, education, health, and so on. So that was all that's the kind of good news. On the other hand, the government embargoed the release of the report the night before we were about to release it because they didn't want to indicate that there were so many people and what the situation was about them. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs, very different approach to working with Afghans in particular. They're all about voluntary repatriation and deportation. And then in Kermanshah, as an example, it can take a lot of time to get permission to travel to the region. Then you go out there, you see what the needs are, you come back, you say, okay, we're going to do this kind of programming. It takes them weeks to decide that, yes, you can do that. By the time you get the permission, those aren't the needs any longer. You need to move on to something else. So you get sort of stuck in this cycle. So if that's the baseline, what are things like now? Well, in fact, some things have actually remained the same and perhaps even gotten a little bit better. Last March, when we had to reapply for our OFAC license renewal, it actually went through in about 6 weeks. They increased our capacity to $10 million a year that we can take in of goods and cash. European donors have become very interested in supporting us because we are still working in Iran and they want to maintain some kind of relationship. And also, we are still able to get cash into the country. However, it takes longer to get permission to travel outside of Tehran. There's more insistence on working with government-selected partners, and they would rather that we didn't use our sort of impartial criteria for picking program participants, but just not even ask how the participants were selected. Needless to say, we won't operate under those circumstances. And then even though we do have an OFAC license to import goods, the fact is that many sellers of those goods don't want their goods to go into Iran. They're not comfortable with the risk that they would be taking, even though we actually have specific license to be able to do that. So it's much harder to run our programs now, but it's not impossible.
Thank you, Nancy.
Our experience is pretty similar. With the difference that because we work with local NGOs, we really don't have much issues traveling to the areas that we work with. The biggest issue we have faced really for a long time, not necessarily just recently, is the fact that once a need is identified, until we're able to provide the help because of the sanctions, because of funding, because of raising money, because of actual the logistics of getting the help, that's really been the biggest challenge. And by the time we get the license, as Nancy said, the need may not be there. And I think really the biggest kind of the crisis creates chaos where, it's something that we need to immediately respond. We know people in, like right now in Azerbaijan, the cold winter is setting and people need help, but we have to sit here and question, can we do this? Can we not do this? How can we do this? How can we make sure that it's effective? So a lot of our challenges really have to do with how quickly we can respond under the sanctions. We've had OFAC licenses for a long time. Again, getting those licenses, they kind of really test your patience because like 2 days before it expires, you're finally granted your license. So it really doesn't help no, I shouldn't say it doesn't help. It makes long-term planning rather difficult and challenging because you don't know whether they're going to grant it to you. So you really have to be very careful about what you plan for next year or for next 2 years. And despite that, we're a very small organization. I'm actually totally honored to be here sitting next to Nancy, who has like a huge organization and they do fantastic work. But we're like the little engine that could, and we'll do what we need, what we can to get the help that we want to bring to people. But really, sanctions just make it so much more difficult. One would think that delivering humanitarian work, kind of being in the work of kind of dealing with the need and the kind of the emotional part of helping in a humanitarian space is difficult, and it is, no doubt that is. But I tell you, it's so much easier than having to deal with sanctions and kind of being very careful that you're crossing the T's, dotting the I's, double checking with your attorneys. And I have to say, I feel so scared after hearing what Eric talked about, but I'm also confident that having two best lawyers in town behind our organization, it really, really gives us confidence to keep going forward despite the challenges.
Thank you. I'm very honored to be here. So I'd like to shift gears a little and ask Elika to talk about her experiences working on trade with Iran and how the position of banks and their over-compliance as a result of the sanctions has impacted basic needs of those in Iran, including medical devices and medicine.
Okay. So with respect to banks and over-compliance, I think in the last panel, someone used the term diligent. Banks are diligent. And my caveat to that would be one of the problems that, what the baseline was, going back to what you said, before the JCPOA. The baseline in a lot of banks, it was diligence that was on autopilot. It was diligence that was in the form of templated behavior. So the bank gets any kind of communique with the word Iran in it, oh, template track. Here's the letter that you get, sorry. A human wouldn't even look at it or analyze it in any way. So, when we now entered into the JCPOA period, one of the big challenges with respect to the overcompliance we were starting to see in the beginning, early days of the JCPOA's young, short life that it had, was actually trying to get banks to invest. And Iran is money tomorrow. It's not a Saudi Arabia of money today, now. And so you have to convince these banks to expend resources to go in and overhaul an internal, safe, kind of protection that they have for what? And so that was a big issue. So one, I would point out and just say the banks were regimented and on an autopilot. So now you have the JCPOA signed, and now you've got to try to shift and get them to move off of that. And then I think that kind of with banks has been one of the main challenges. I remember in the early days of the JCPOA, I was on a panel with a couple OFAC folks and someone, it was a bank audience. And someone from BNP Paribas decided to pipe up and share their views. And I have no love lost for banks that engage in willful and knowing violations of U.S. sanctions laws. And they spoke their piece about how concerned they were, how difficult it is, we're just the banks. And when it was, I was trained in New York by Italian feisty attorneys. So I made it very clear to them that when you get slammed with an $8.9 billion fine, sweetie, you deserved it. Okay, don't come to this here and say, oh, but we would like to, oh, but we, because when you play that game, you get the fine that you deserved, and you hurt everyone else in the process. So, we started to see banks give these explanations, oh, we're afraid of the fines, we're afraid of these big, big fines. And so it was really talking them off of the ledge. There's a way to do due diligence in Iran. Oh, you don't have even a Farsi native speaker on your staff. Great. I mean, you can't even, there's a lot of information on the internet in Farsi coming from Iranian government websites that you can start to put together a due diligence package with. So in terms of impact on access and medicine, I have a personal story. I'm sure everyone here does, but I was asked to share it. I'm perfectly comfortable sharing it. My cousin in Iran, she has cancer. She's been to 4 hospitals, and none of them have chemo meds to give her. It is treatable, and she can't get the medication that she needs. I've accepted. I will not see her again, and that's that. That's called being Iranian American these days. So that's one personal, individual example. But in terms of impact on access, one of the big problems with the sanctions regime with respect to Iran is that, you can't always point to, oh, look, sanctions worked in South Africa. They're going to work everywhere. You have to take into account the culture, the religion, the history. And what sanctions do with respect to Iran in general is create a lot of counterintuitive outcomes. So when you say you're going to pull out of the Iran deal, good job, you just encouraged a blossoming in Iran's black market. So initially, I'd say from around the spring of last year through the fall, you started to see hoarding of medications. As we all know, Iran's, it's an opaque market driven by lack of transparency, and our fat hang, our culture is, okay, yeah, that's the rule, but who do I got to call? Come on, give me the number. That's just the mentality there, because they've been, living for 40 years learning how to dodge laws, and that's just ingrained in their mentality. And so you have people who were privileged, the elites, the folks that we know in Iran, just like any country, the elites suffer less when there is any kind of impressive environment. They're hoarding the medications. They're getting the hookups through their friends, the administrators at hospitals. And then, one point I'd want to just make, and I make this very openly when the chamber meets with people in the government, is, you're sanctioning a country that you know full well Iran provides universal health care. You know full well that Iranians are covered, 99% of them are covered by the government's healthcare system. When you sanction a country like that, this is not intended to hit civilians. Of course it is. We all know that. If we hit them hard enough, 2009 will finish itself. They'll come back into the streets, and it's hard to convey to U.S. policymakers that our generation is not the generation of our parents. I'm not going to pick up Neda's body and run towards the bullets with her. That's what the last generation did, and that momentum is depleted, rightfully so. And, I think that now we have a black market environment with respect to the medical devices and medicines that is hurting everyone. It hurts OFAC's policies and prerogatives. It hurts the United States. It hurts legitimate pharmaceutical companies that want to do business in Iran. Of course, it hurts the Iranians. And it also prevents the hope of the JCPOA, which was to help encourage the growth of a normal private sector in Iran. So on medical equipment, when the JCPOA existed, and this is just to kind of bring to terms how stark the shift has been. When the JCPOA existed, there was a contact of our chambers, who's an American with an American entity. He had a good relationship with the hospitals in Iran and administrators there. And the Iranians basically conveyed to him, we want to build 8 hospitals in Iran, U.S. designed, U.S. equipped. So that means it's General Electric's MRI machines, it's not Siemens. And that deal was valued at over $8 billion. And one of the things that the chamber does is when we work with companies, we ask them, if you're willing, can you provide us a 10-year forecast of your expected revenue that you could potentially earn in Iran? And we will go and we will share that with, let's say, their congressional representative. And you had that kind of a deal. You had another American company that's working on treatment of inner ear and vestibular disorders, and they had projected over $100 million in revenue over a 10-year period in Iran. And so during the JCPOA time period, on the last panel they alluded to, OFAC doesn't, the word humanitarian has this much value for OFAC. I think when we start to kind of accept that, we can be more effective when it comes to OFAC. They want the bottom line. And so our chamber, during the period that the JCPOA was a little baby, we had a lot of receptivity on the Hill, a lot of receptivity, because when you can point to the dollar sign and you can say, either the European company's going to go in or our company's going to go in, which one do you want? Come on, it worked, and we were on a track to really allow American companies as well to have the same opportunities that European companies have had for some time. So now, what has happened, of course, it's really dead from what we see in terms of what people are willing to say. Behind closed doors on the Hill, I won't say everybody, I will just say every office I have met with, Republican or Democrat, once the doors closed, they all were in favor of the JCPOA and more trade with Iran. Hands down. Of course, I didn't go meet with Tom Cotton, so let's put some exceptions out there. But in general, folks, Senator Cochran of former Senator Cochran of Mississippi, folks that you wouldn't necessarily think would support the deal, they are bottom line driven, and they were very receptive and very eager. So now I think medical equipment has been hit very hard, and I think if you want to come back to the European side, I can fill that in.
Thank you, Elika. We can take one question from the audience, and then we have to wrap up very quickly.
Sure. So the question was basically, legally these transactions, humanitarian, medicine, whatever, are allowed, but they're not doing it. So in the context of a chilling effect, what do we do? And she's absolutely right that it is a chilling. It's psychological. They know what works. No company, no pharmaceutical company wants to be the first one forward. And that is the chilling effect. So one of the things that we can do, and we've decided to follow up on this in DC, is one of the places where our chamber at least had success was okay, instead of going to Abbott or instead of going to a certain pharmaceutical company that you know on the inside they are in favor of you, but they won't come out and make any comment about this, so then why use them? Go to their trade associations. Some of the best and most fruitful meetings that I had were with trade associations. Go to the industry group for the pharmaceuticals. Go to NAM, the National Association of Manufacturers. NAM actually has a sanctions Iran-specific task force internally. You wouldn't know unless you had a meeting with them, because again, these things are all internal. But what the trade associations can do is join forces with organizations like ours. Go to the Hill together. The companies feel safe telling their trade association a lot of their nitty-gritty details because the organization that takes the heat is the trade association. The companies are protected behind this faceless entity. So I think that some of the things we could think about for our community is not only as individual Iranian Americans, if you haven't had a meeting yet or requested a meeting with the local office of your congressperson, do it. Go for it. Go in there, introduce yourself. If you're part of IABA, we can coordinate and go in with them. And I think that the trade associations are one place where they've been around for long enough that the psychological, they've seen the ebbs and flows of psychological chilling effects across different markets globally. And I think that's at least one place where the chilling effect hasn't penetrated, because it's the job of a trade association to get their members' business wherever, whenever, as much as possible.
And if I could just add on, because you talked about two components. One is the pharmaceuticals and the other is the banks. And I think for many companies, they can sort of hide behind the bank question. We've been in conversations where we've taken the banks off the table by figuring out other ways to handle the finances. And still, it's hard for the manufacturers to step up. Partly it's the size. If you're doing just sort of a single humanitarian purchase, the volume of the transaction is not really big. So the risk-reward problem sort of steps in. But that's why we've been talking about trying to just hear about if we can't figure out a different way to get through that blockage. Because we figured out how to deal with the banking blockage, but we haven't figured out this one yet.
And we have, at least I personally have contacted many elected officials, men and women, and in regards to sanctions. And one of their questions, which I was able to respond to prior to JCPOA in 2016, but now I have a problem responding to the question that how did the money that was given to the government post signing a JCPOA get to the Iranian people? I mean, you see, right after that we had a few national disasters, and at the end we have Nancy here, who goes out there and does all of that, whereas we didn't see the government.
Oh, no, make no mistake. The Iranian government is incredibly well organized for doing immediate humanitarian response between the Iranian Red Crescent Society, which is sort of part of, as well as their deployment of the army, basically. They get out there, they get things happening very quickly. The problem is they leave relatively quickly. So they may get people into emergency shelter, but then the people are freezing in the emergency shelter 2 weeks later when the temperatures drop, or a month later when the temperature drops. So it's actually pretty awesome compared to some other countries in their ability to respond, but it is not the sustainable kind of response that really helps people get back up on their feet. So there's some limitations.
Thank you, everyone. We'll wrap up, and then if anyone has questions, please come to speak with us. Thank you again, and
Thank you.
Thanks for listening.